الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. Alhamdulillah. In our lessons on Imam Sawi's commentary on Jawhara al-Tawhid in Islamic Beliefs, we have started looking at the affirmative attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we began looking at the divine attribute of power, of qudra. And we looked at the definition of qudra in the context of how we understand the affirmative attributes. That the affirmative attributes, what are they? These are, there's three parts to that. These are eternal attributes. These are eternal meanings. That's what we mean. That are affirmed, that are necessary for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that subsist through the divine entity, that affirm a meaning above and beyond the meaning of Allah being the necessary existent. And each entails a consequence. Right? That's the meaning that that particular attribute affirms. So the divine power, what is it? It's an eternal attribute that is necessary for Allah, that subsists by the entity of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And what does power do? By Allah's power, He originates anything possible in accordance with His eternal will, right? So that's where we reached, and we talked about the key aspects. One of the important investigations that is coming up is the investigation related to what we affirm about how we understand the attachments or the relationships, what are called the ta'alluqat of these divine attributes. And these are, this is an important investigation that clarifies many matters, but that's coming. So now there's a couple of clarificatory issues that Imam Sawi now touches upon in his commentary, and that's where we start today, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So he tells us, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayhi, that وَدَخَلَ فِي قَوْلِنَا كُلِّ مُمْكِنْ أَفْعَالُنَا الْإِخْتِيَارِيَّةِ. In our saying that Allah's power originates anything possible, he said this includes our own willful actions, the actions that we choose to do. Right? Right? That those actions that we choose to do are also by Allah's creating. And this is one of the great theological questions. We will be building up our understanding of this issue step by step as we go through this section. Because to understand the relationship between divine decree and Allah being the creator of all things and human choice, we need to understand three critical divine attributes: divine knowledge, divine will, and divine power. And by understanding those, then we understand what is divine decree, what is qada, and what is destiny, qadr, insofar as we can understand it, right? Then when we understand these, then we need to look at what is the nature of the human being. So what is the nature of the human being? What capacity, what istita'a does the human being have? What do we understand about human moral responsibility, taklif? What do we understand about human choices, ikhtiyar, and what is meant by the doctrine of kasb, of acquisition, of praise or blame for the choices that we make. Right? So we affirm all of this. We affirm that the human being is created by Allah with capacity, with moral responsibility, with choice, and how they direct this choice gives them, then this causes them to acquire, this is called kasb, the Quranic terminology, acquire either praise or blame. And we'll be building up each of these systematically in the looking at this text, right? If you want to see some answers related to this, inshallah we can share. We have a video, we have a few human choice, divine decree and human choice. We can share that in the stream as well, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. You can find a number of resources related to that on Seekers. So we affirm that human beings, those actions that are within our choices, we affirm human choice, right? We have to be clear about that. We affirm human choice, right? But ultimately, we affirm both rationally and by revelation that Allah is the creator of everything. Therefore, that includes both the human being and their actions. Why? And we'll see the details of that. He says, فَخَالِقٌ لِعَبْدِهِ وَمَا عَمِلْ. Right? He is the creator of the servant and all that they do, and we'll look at that there. But if we leverage off what we've looked at before, that Allah is the necessary existent, wajib al-wujud. Everything else is merely possible. Anything in contingent existence only comes into existence because Allah originated it. That origination happens by divine choice and by divine power. And then it only remains in existence because Allah is sustaining it. That applies to all of existence. Anything that exists besides Allah, which is it exists, it is originally merely possible. It comes to exist. It is originated by the power of Allah. It remains by the power of Allah. So if that's a reality of everything, then that you and all that is in existence is originated by Allah and sustained by Allah at every moment, then a fortiori, our actions and choices are also created. However, Allah has placed this subtle reality of choice in human beings, right? And that choice is distinct from the choice of other animals. That's why we have moral responsibility. We can't deny that reality, and we'll be looking at its details. But here, insofar as it relates to power, he says that this includes human actions. فَفِيهِ رَدٌّ عَلَى الْمُعْتَزِلَةِ. This is a refutation of the Mu'tazila, القائلين بأن العبد يخلق أفعال نفسه الاختيارية. And this contains within it a refutation of the Mu'tazila, who are a rationalist sect, who said that the human being creates their willful actions, that they actually create them. And by creation meaning that they independently bring them out from non-existence into existence. While the Sunni mainstream affirms that yes, the human being has actions, and what they have with respect to the actions is that human beings have moral responsibility, taklif, they have capacity, istita'a, and they have choice, they have ikhtiyar, and how they direct that choice with their contingent will and their contingent power, they acquire, they have kasb of praise or blame, reward or potential punishment. Right? So the denial that the human being creates their actions does not negate moral responsibility, does not negate the affirmation of human capacity or ability, does not negate human choice, does not negate the being fit for praise or blame, right? Okay, and more of is coming on that, but just to clarify the distinction. Then he says, وَكَمَا أَنَّ قُدْرَةَ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى تَتَعَلَّقُ بِالْإِيجَادِ تتعلق بالإعدام على المشهور وقيل لا تتعلق بالإعدام بل إذا أراد الله إعدام شيء أمسك عنه المدد. Right? So he says, just as divine power relates to originating, ijad, it also relates to extinguishing, taking out of existence, according to the widespread position of the theologians. Right? And this points to the fact that there is a difference amongst the theologians regarding this. And others said, right, that no, divine power does not need to relate to the opposite of originating, which is extinguishing things, ending things, because if Allah wills for something to cease to exist, i'dam, He simply stops His madad, His sustaining it, right? So there are two things. Allah has ijad, right? He originates, and then He has imdad, then He sustains. They said no, the original state of things is nothingness. They come into existence through ijad, through being originated, and then they remain by the imdad of Allah, which is the same as ijad. Allah originated something, and then He sustains it at every moment. That's called imdad. And this is a Quranic term. كُلًّا نُمِدْ هَؤُلَاءِ وَهَؤُلَاءِ مِنْ عَطَاءِ رَبِّكَ. All do we sustain, these and those, from the willful giving, the ata of your Lord. So if Allah wills for something to stop existing, He simply stops supporting it. And this second opinion is actually the position of Imam al-Ash'ari himself, the founder of the Ash'ari school. And most the muhaqqiqeen, the scholars of verification, actually appear to have chosen this opinion, right? And there's a good footnote here, quoting a very influential book in later Islamic theology, which is the Hashia of Imam al-Dasuqi on Imam Sanusi's al-Barahin. So Imam Sanusi wrote a whole curriculum, deeply influential in Islamic theology, and he structured it. Of course, he didn't author it in that order, right? But he wrote a series of very short primers, Sughra, and the Muqaddimat, and the Sughra, and then he has Al-Wusta, and then Al-Kubra, and he commented on pretty much all of them. And each of the works had many others who commented upon them and wrote super commentaries, and particularly in North Africa, but some of the text throughout, particularly al-Barahin, the foundational proofs, and that's actually the level 2 study text at Seeker's Guidance, and level 3 covers the Hashia of Imam al-Bajuri on al-Barahin, this very important text by Imam al-Sanusi. Imam al-Sanusi himself wrote a commentary on it, and the greatest of the glosses, the greatest of the hawashi on al-Barahin is either the Hashiyat of Imam al-Bajuri, which is brief and precise, and that's what Shaykh Hamza Karam Ali teaches at level 3 at Seekers, and Hamza had the honor of studying that fully with Shaykh Adib Kallas in Damascus, rahimahullah ta'ala. Or that Hashia is directly on Sharh al-Barahin, Imam al-Sanusi's commentary on his own text. sorry, Imam Sanusi's own text. Hashiyat al-Bajuri is directly on the matan. So it's as if it's a sharh. But it's a hashiyah because he doesn't explain every word. It's bil qawl, qawluhu kada, right? It's and Imam al-Dasuqi wrote a much more extensive work on Sanusi's commentary. Hashiyat al-Dasuqi, and that has more details. Bajuri's work is brilliant because of its precision, and it's sort of like, it tends to be the last sort of, as if it's the last word on things, right? He's real because he's came after most of these other scholars well into the 19th century. Ad-Dasuqi, who's from a similar era as Imam al-Bajuri, his work is highly praised by the ulama, and they frequently refer to it. So it's detailed out over there. Okay. Now Imam Sawi rahimahullah makes a very important clarification. This is something not to forget. So he says, وَالتَّعْرِيفُ فِي صِفَاتِ الْبَارِ جَلَّ وَعَلَى لَيْسَتْ حُدُودًا حَقِيقِيَّةً وَإِنَّمَا هِيَ رُسُومٌ لِأَنَّهُ لا يعلم كنه ذاته تعالى وصفاته سبحانه إلا هو. Right? Says the definitions given for the attributes of the originating Lord, Allah, mighty and majestic, are not real definitions, but rather they are descriptive definitions. Right? A had is ta'rifu shay bimahiyatihi. As we will be looking in the logic class, a definition, a formal definition, right? And there's a good 2 footnotes here, right? So a had is ta'rifu shay bimahiyatihi, is defining something by its essential reality. And for a real definition, a had, right? And a had, it's called that because it's a delimiting definition. It lays down the limits, right? And the shart in it is that it be jami' mani', right? Right, so it's ta'rif الشيء بماهيته, right? It's defining something by its mahiyya, by its essential reality, right? And شرطه أن يكون جامعا مانعا, right? And the condition of, amongst the key characteristics of a delimiting definition is that هو جامع لما يدخل في مفهومه ومانع عما سواه. That everything that enters within the reality of what's being defined is encompassed by the definition, and it excludes all else. But this does not apply, right? Because we cannot fathom the reality of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, both rationally and by what Allah tells us revelationally in the Quran and on the tongue of His Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right? And you can see some beautiful quotes right at the beginning of the Aqidah fi al-Tahawi, and the diligent student would do well to note those expressions down here. Right? لا تدركه الأفهام ولا تبلغه الأوهام. That understandings cannot reach his full reality. Right? And he'll be, we talked a little bit about that earlier when we talked about the attribute of being, so review that. But rather they are descriptive. They are descriptive, which, right? Which is to define something by its traces, by its, by some of its characteristics. Right? Defining something by some of its characteristics. Right? So, For example, when we say that Allah's power, can we conceive of the reality of divine power? No. But what we can affirm is that, well, this is what it is an affirmative attribute, so that's the first part of the definition. And what do we understand for it? يَتَأَتَّى بِهَا إِيجَادُ كُلِّ مُمْكِنٍ. By it, all possible things are originated. So we affirm that. But we never have this, I know the attributes of Allah. You don't know their reality. Right? And you can review what the author mentioned in the quotes regarding that, right? It's one of the dangers of the study of theology as well, that we have to be aware. That don't be smug about Allah, right? That I know Allah, right? 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 Rather, the role of the intellect is limited in comparison with the true locus of knowing Allah. The mind can affirm. This is what we affirm about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But that is very basic faith, right? That's very basic faith, right? And do review the section on, right? And we can share here the poem of Shaykh Abdul Rahman al-Shaghuri, who's an accomplished theologian and student of an inheritor of the knowledge of one of the greatest theologians of the 20th century, without doubt, Shaykh Muhammad al-Hashimi al-Tilimsani, the author of Miftah al-Jannah في شرح عقيدة أهل السنة. In one of his poems he says that ترك العقل في هواك رجال ليس للعقل في سناك مجال ذاك عقل من الحدوث تبدى وعليه من الكثيف عقال. That accomplished ones left for your sake their intellects behind. For the intellect alone has no role in recognizing your dazzling beauty. Why? ذاك عقل من الحدوث تبدى, because that intellect is only manifest in the context of originatedness, حدوث. وعليه من الكثيف عقال, and it is tied down by the tangible traces of created things, right? Because the analogical mind works by making analogy from knowables to something unknown. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exists with His attributes beyond all human categories. Right? Right? But then how does one come to know Allah? Of course, leaving the intellect behind, meaning of course one needs to learn the aqidah and understand it, but one has to appreciate, and the theologians themselves don't claim that the intellect is how you become close to Allah. How do you perfect your faith? Right? The intellect enables you to know sound beliefs and understand sound beliefs, and it protects sound belief, right? But that is, but theology on your own merely gets you to understand, to a certain amount of intellectual understanding. But as Imam Laqqani mentions himself earlier, how does faith increase? The theologians in their own books don't claim that do more and more of theology and you'll grow and grow in your faith. No, of course. Understanding sharpens faith. Being able to inoculate yourself, can help round out your understanding of faith. But that is like knowing recipes. Right? The recipe does not make a cook. Right? That faith is strengthened by the strengthening of one's acts of devotion, al-ta'a. So Shaykh Abdul Rahman says, and we'll share the poem inshallah at this lesson. It says, لكن القوم منك فازوا بقرب بأداء الفروض قاموا وقالوا. Rather, the people of Allah attained felicity by you to attain your closeness, and they devoted themselves to fulfilling their obligations, right? Right? With excellence. Right? Okay. And then he explains something, and we will look, and this is arguably before its place, right? Because it'll be coming up in the investigation on the relationships of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he says, وَعْلَمْ أَنَّ أَعْدَامَنَا الْأَزَلِيَّةَ لَا تَتَعَلَّقُ بِهَا الْقُدْرَةُ وَلَا الْإِرَادَةُ اتِّفَاقًا لِوُجُوبِهَا أما أعدامنا فيما لا يزال السابقة على وجودنا ووجودنا بعد عدمنا واستمرار وجودنا وإعدامنا بعد وجودنا وإيجادنا يوم القيامة فمن تعلقات القدرة والإرادة. Right? So this is a clarifying of what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's power and His will relate to. Right? So you can break this paragraph into two parts. What Allah's will and power don't relate to, and what do they relate to? So he says, and know well that are non-being in pre-eternity, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's power and His will do not relate to it. Because when we don't exist, there is no need for the will to relate to it. We don't exist. The will doesn't have to do anything. The original state is nothingness. So the scale, though we are merely possible, but creation starts off in nothingness. That state of nothingness, neither will needs to relate to it nor power. Right? But then there is a moment at which we go from not existing to existing. That conceptual moment is when Allah's will and power does relate to that. And that conceptual moment they call فيما لا يزال. Right? And this is now in consideration of time. So the moment when Allah's will specifies us, and His power originates, and that conceptual moment, Allah's will and power do in fact relate to us. They also relate to our existence after being non-existent. Allah's power also relates to our remaining in existence. So at that point from non-existence to existence, the will specifies for the preponderation to take place that okay, you will exist and you will exist. It doesn't have to, Allah's will does not have to direct to everything that won't exist. Right? There's no need. So the moment you're specified, this is conceptually. So Allah's will relates in the context of time to your being originated, and the power then brings it into existence. Right? But then to remain in existence, Allah's power relates to keeping it in existence. And this was eternally willed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah's will and power also relate to our ceasing to exist after originating us, and to our being re-originated on the day of resurrection. All of these are from the relationships of the divine power and divine will. And So this summarizes a lengthy discussion that if you look in the author's commentary, Umdat al-Murid and elsewhere, you can see an extensive discussion. What exactly does divine will and power relate to, and what doesn't it actually relate to? But really, this investigation belongs where we discuss the relationships of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's attributes. It'll be clearer when we cover it then, so we don't need to unpack it fully right now. But here, what you can do, you can diagram it, what Allah's will and power do in fact relate to, and what they don't relate to, and what they do relate to. When you break it down, it becomes clear. And then he clarifies another thing, that what is the possible? Right? And the ulama looked, you could talk about the possible in all kinds of ways, but ultimately they reduce down the possible is 6 matters. All possible existing things come down to 6 considerations. So he says, وأقسام الممكنات ستة أشار لها بعضهم بقوله رحمه الله الممكنات المتقابلات وجودنا والعدم الصفات أزمنة أمكنة جهات كذا المقادير روى الثقات. Right? So this is quoted by several of the commentators on Jawhara al-Tawhid. So, for example, you can see this unpacked a little bit in Bajuri's Tuhfat al-Murid and also in Hashiyat al-Dasuqi in the same investigation, and these are good to look up for the diligent student. And it wouldn't hurt here, these two, if we just take the snapshot of from Hashiyat al-Bajuri, Tuhfat al-Murid, and also Hashiyat al-Dasuqi on al-Barahin, and just to put it with the resources for this class, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So he says, so he quotes this line of poetry that the possible things in apposition are our existence and non-existence, our attributes, times, places, and directions. Likewise, extents, right? Like maqadir, extents, literally quantities, so do the trustworthy relate. Our existence or non-existence, our attributes, times, places, directions. Directions are relative places to other things, and extents, weight, volume, size, etc. This is all that, there's nothing you can describe at a fundamental level, the possible, by that's outside of these things. Much of it's covered by attributes, right? So he's clarifying the definition, right? That's why definitions are so important, right? Shaykh Adib Kallas, and we've mentioned this before, would always say, right? Shaykh Adib would say, always, بالتعريف, right? Or تعرف الأمور, right? Right? So he would say, تعرف الأمور بالتعريف, right? Things are known by their it's an obvious thing to say, but you always apply it. Someone ask any question about any of the attributes of Allah, say, okay, what is the definition of this attribute? Good. What's the definition of this attribute? Good. What's the relationship between them? Good. Do you understand the issue? Right? So you take things back to their definitions, right? Because that's how sound thinking happens, right? That's why we study logic with Islamic beliefs, right? Okay. ومعنى على وفق الإرادة أن ما خصصه سبحانه وتعالى بإرادته أبرزه سبحانه بقدرته، فالإرادة سابقة على القدرة، يعني في التعقل لا في الزمان. So what's meant by in accordance with His will, that whatever Allah Most High specifies with His eternal will, He manifests with His power. So the divine will precedes the divine power. And this is conceptually, not temporal. في التعقل, conceptually. Right? And what is the specification? It's those 6 things that were mentioned. Right? Right? And he clarifies that. إن قلت إنهما قديمان فلا يتصور سبقية. Said if you say they're both eternal, so how can you conceive of one being before the other? أجيب بأن السبقية بالنظر للتعلق التنجيزي لا بالنظر لذات الصفات ولا للصلاحية. The answer is that this order is in terms of their effective relationships, not with respect to the actual attribute itself. Right? And not by considering the salahiyya, the potentiality of each attribute. Right? Allah's will potentially, eternally relates to specifying anything possible, with anything possible for it. Right? Of these 6 things that we mentioned. That's the تعلق الصلوحي القديم, right? The potential eternal relationship of Allah's will. But then eternally Allah's will actually effectively specifies some of the possible with some of what is possible for it. That's called التعلق التنجيزي القديم. Eternally Allah effectively specifies some of the possible with some of what is possible for it. That's the تعلق التنجيزي القديم. Eternally. So the order is in the relationship between will and power, in the effective relationship of Allah's will and the effective relationship of Allah's power, not in terms of the attribute themselves. With respect to the other way to, not to unpack all of that, for example, for the common person, you would say that there's a conceptual order between these attributes, between the function of the attributes, not a time-related order, because time does not relate to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we don't need to break down what we mean by a conceptual order, that this is, you need the sabqiyya is بين التعلق التنجيزي القديم للإرادة والتعلق التنجيزي الحادث للقدرة. The order is between the effective eternal relationship of Allah's will, insofar as what He actually specifies eternally with His will, and the effective temporal relationship of Allah Most High's power, because Allah's power originates in the context of temporality, of time. Okay? So with respect to the relationship of these attributes, there is a temporal order, sabqiyya. But the attributes themselves are eternal. That's why they talk about the ta'alluqat. And we'll be coming more to that later. So if you don't fully understand, take note of what we have mentioned, and you can either read ahead or stay tuned, because it's coming up with مزيد إيضاح. ودليل اتصافه سبحانه بالقدرة أن نقول الله صانع قديم له مصنوع حادث وكل ما كان كذلك لا بد له من قدرة يوجد بها الأشياء ويعدمها فينتج الله تعالى لا بد له من قدرة. The proof that Allah Most High is characterized by the attribute of power is to say that Allah is an eternal creator. He has an originated creation. And anyone who is like this requires a power by which he originates things or takes them out of existence, right? With the difference that we talked about. The conclusion, therefore, would be that Allah requires the attribute of power. That's self-evident, right? It's not conceivable that there be creation without the creator having the will to choose to create and the power to actually originate what they willed to create. Right? And this is why some of the theologians argued that the subject matter of the science of Islamic beliefs is not Allah, but it is creation. Right? Because if you can establish that this world is created, khalas, it needs a creator. Right? So the most obvious way of denying the belief in God is not to argue about God, is to go on and on about creation. All we need to prove about creation is that it's created or that it's originated. Or we need to shift the discourse from talking about this world, which is what the scientists do, because what does science talks about what exists, right? To shift the discourse from that to talk about God Himself, right? To talk about the necessary existent. Then you've taken them out of their turf, right? And it's much easier to talk in your language than someone else's language. Sometimes you're forced to talk in their language, but the way to get your way with somebody is to say, okay, let's agree to talk in these terms. Because you have a right to talk, I have a right to talk, right? And that's part of what is studied in an important but neglected science called ilmu adab al-bahth wal-munazara. The science, and it's a science on the proper manners, right? Or the etiquette of research and debate. And it's not about arguing with people, but how to convey. There's a science to it and an art. That's why it has both ilm and adab in the title, right? Of research and debate. Because there's an ethic to it as well. There's an ethic to it, but also there's a purpose to it, right? Which is that the knowledge that we have, we want to, be able to convey it clearly and convincingly. Okay. وَقُدْرَةٌ إِرَادَةٌ وَغَايَرَةٌ. So he says, al-irada, the divine will. And it's put in this order because of the nature of poetry, right? Or because we can relate more directly to power than we can relate to will. Right? Because power is more tangible, insofar it has tangible traces. هي لغة القصد. In the Arabic language, irada, will, is resolve. You resolve to do something. واصطلاحا, but formally, صفة أزلية زائدة على الذات قائمة بذاته. It's an eternal attribute that affirms a meaning above the meaning of the entity itself, subsisting through the entity of Allah Most High. شأنها تخصيص الممكن ببعض ما يجوز عليه. Whose sha'n, whose nature is that it specifies the possible with some of what is possible for it. Will specifies. So Allah's will can in itself specify anything possible for anything possible. That's what's called التعلق الصلوحي القديم. It is fit. It can potentially relate to specifying anything possible for anything possible. But it effectively specifies some of the possible with some of what's possible for it. Eternally. فقولنا قائمة بذاته تعالى, are saying, subsisting through the entity of Allah, يعني أن ذاته متصفة بها, meaning that the divine entity is characterized by this attribute. وقولنا ببعض ما يجوز عليه, are saying by with some of what relates to it, وهو واحد من الستة المتقدمة, and that's one of these 6 characteristics. فلا يخرج عن إرادة الله تعالى شيء من الممكنات. So nothing of the possible is outside the will of Allah Most High. لأن تعلقها كتعلق القدرة, because the relationship of Allah's will is like the relationship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's power. فلا تتعلق بالواجبات. So Allah's power does not relate to the necessary for the reasons that we took, because it will be redundant. The necessary already is, so it didn't need to relate to it for it to come into existence. It must be, so it doesn't need to relate to it to remain in existence. And it cannot not be, so it cannot relate to it insofar as making it stop being. ولا المستحيلات, and the same would apply to the absurd, the mustahil. وإنما تتعلق بالممكنات, and it only makes sense for it to relate to the possible. خيرها وشرها, whether good or bad. Whether good or bad. Right? And right? يعني الخير والشر إنما يفهم بالنسبة للخلق للخالق. Right? Good and bad are only understandable, conceivable with respect to creation, not with respect to the Creator. Yani? Because Allah is the Malik. He is Rabbul Alameen. He is the Lord of the whole universe. He created them from nothing. And it belongs to Him. Inna lillah, we are Allah's. Right? Right? What is the relationship with the Creator and creation? Allah created us from nothing. We belong to Him. So whatever He does with us, it's up to Him. Right? للمالك أن يفعل في ملكه ما يشاء. Right? And we'll be looking at this further. But the owner can do with what they own as they wish. Right? And we'll be looking at an example of a debate on this issue between some of the mainstream, one of the great Imams of Ahl Sunnah with some of the Mu'tazila, right? Because they said, no, God must only do the good, and that's coming. Shaykh Adib here would use an example that imagine if someone has a tree in their backyard. It's theirs. But then they realize that, you know what, I need a new dining table. And they didn't really need the tree in the backyard, so they chopped down the tree. Do they have a right to chop down their own tree? Yeah, they chop down the tree. So they then chopped it up, dried it, etc. And they made the table, the dining table, really nice. They polished it, they put it in the dining room. Some wood still remained. So they say, you know what? The toilet seat has gotten quite old. Let's make a wooden toilet seat. So there's a little bit of enough wood to make a toilet seat. So they made the toilet seat and the lid, and they polished it and really nicely. So they made that too. Now there's still some wood left. Winter is coming. So they said, okay, this remaining wood, let's use it for firewood. Now, could the toilet seat wood, does the toilet seat wood have a right of complaining that you honored the wood of the table, that it's in an honored place, and it's a place where people feast and celebrate and so on? As for me, I'm being used in the toilet, and the lights are out most of the time, and it's cold and musty and and lengthy complaint. If wood could express itself, could it complain against the owner? It is a court of existence. No. And the fire would complain, why are you complaining? At least you get to live. They just burnt me to ashes. Right? And of course that's in a relative sense. But لِلْمَالِكِ أَنْ يَفْعَلَ فِي مُلْكِهِ مَا يَشَاءُ. The fact that Allah has mercy on us is humbling. And He's told us, وَرَحْمَتِي وَسِعَتْ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ. Right? So, right, and more is coming on this. Right? وَقَوْلُهُمْ إِنَّ الصَّلَاحَ وَاجِبٌ عَلَيْهِ زُورٌ مَا عَلَيْهِ وَاجِبٌ. And they're saying that Allah must do what's better for the servant, or what is good for the servant, is a lie. Nothing is necessary for Allah. Right? Why? لِلَّهِ فِعْلُ كُلِّ مُمْكِنٍ وَتَرْكُهُ. مُقْتَضَى الرُّبُوبِيَّة, what is entailed by divine lordship, is Allah can do anything possible or not do it. And recognition of this reality humbled the prophets in awe. Right? That's why the Prophet ﷺ said, I am the most knowing of you of Allah, and I am the most reverent of you of Allah. Why? Because what is the nature of divine will? It's mutlaq. It's absolute. What's the nature of divine power? It's absolute. This is why Sayyidina Umar radiallahu ta'ala said, if I had one, someone promised paradise on the tongue of his Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but yet he would say, if I had one foot in paradise, I would not feel safe until I had my second foot in paradise. Why? Because you recognize the greatness of lordship. Right? بين جلال وجمال. The heart of the believer is between the majesty of Allah and His mercy. The mercy gives us hope. The absoluteness of divine majesty gives us fear. But we know that inna rahmati tasbiqu ghadabi, that my mercy outstrips my wrath. Ar-Rahmanu ala al-arsh istawa, that on the throne of lordship it is the all-merciful who's established. That's how He has chosen to deal with His creation. And the throne, which is a real creation, the throne is a sign of divine majesty. But Allah is established in His lordship, in His majesty, with encompassing mercy, right? So in that context, إِنَّمَا تَعَلَّقُ بِالْمُمْكِنَاتِ خَيْرِهَا وَشَرِّهَا. So Allah's will relates to all that is possible, both its good and its evil. But the good and evil relates, it's only insofar as what we deem to be good and bad. And here, inshallah, we have two things that we'd like to share, and these are necessary resources. You can find, and actually the resource from Qawaid al-Aqaid, you can find it digitally online, because the Qawaid al-Aqaid is available digitally online, or we can. So he talks about the nature of good and evil in Qawaid al-Aqaid, book 2 of the Ihya. And Sidi Hamza can share that on an expedited basis. And then Imam al-Ghazali has one of the most beautiful discussions on understanding good and bad, good and evil, in his al-Iqtisad fil i'tiqad. He has a section in that. Right? And we can share that as well. Right? So Qawaid al-Aqaid discusses this, I think, in the third section. In the third section of Qawaid al-Aqaid, which is book 2 of the Ihya. And Sidi Hamza can look that up. And we can share the Arabic of it, but also the English. The English is online, I think on the Masood Khan website. But if we can put it in a PDF, the related pages from the actual translation, that would be beautiful. And the section on Tahseen wa Taqbih, on good and bad, from Imam al-Ghazali's al-Iqtisad fil i'tiqad, we'll share that in Arabic for those who can understand it. That's a beautiful investigation, and I'd highly urge any serious student of knowledge to read that. And of course, then there's some nuances between the Ash'aris and Maturidis with respect to the nature of good and bad, but at a fundamental level, that this is Imam Ghazali's explanation is dazzling. Later, inshallah, when we get to the next text, we'll go into the ikhtilaf between the Ash'aris and the Maturidis on it. But anyways, so فالشرور والقبائح بإرادة الله كغيرها. So both evil and so evil things and vile things are also willed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. ولا تنسب إليه, but they are not, right? But ولا تنسب إليه. إليه أدبا وتعظيما. Okay? But we don't, this is affirmed, but there's an adab with the divine, right? Just as there's adab with people. You meet somebody, so if someone comes to you at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, do you say, so how was the toilet today? How was, you don't say things like that. How was your breath this morning? Most people have bad breath before they brush their teeth, whatever. But that's not how you talk to people. Why? Because there's an adab and there's a respect. So what does Sayyidina Ibrahim say? Right? The Abrahamic adab with the divine. هو الذي يطعمني. So the whole verse. Yeah. هو الذي خلقني ثم right? Right? So this is from Surah Ash-Shu'ara, right? 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 Surah Ash-Shu'ara, verse so Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam, of course this is part of the proof that when he was talking about the idols, this was a ihtijaj. He was not trying to come to faith, but he was laying out his reflection, right? But so Surah Ash-Shu'ara, verses 78 to 83. He says, الذي خلقني. So actually, let's start from the verses. فإنهم عدو لي إلا رب العالمين. Right? So in his, right? So the set of verses begin, of course, from verse 69. وَاتْلُ عَلَيْهِمْ نَبَأَ إِبْرَاهِيمَ. Relate to them the story, the news of Ibrahim, or the story of Ibrahim. Right? إِذْ قَالَ لِأَبِيهِ وَقَوْمِهِ مَا تَعْبُدُونَ. When he said to his father and his people, what do you worship? And you can see the verses, right? It's a beautiful set of verses. From Surah Al-Shu'ara. And I've shared it in the on base camp for those of you hanging out over there. But then what's the Mawdi' al-Shahid, the Abrahamic adab, right? He says from verse 78 of Surah Al-Shu'ara, he says, الذي خلقني فهو يهدين. The one who created me, and it is he who guides me. وَالَّذِي هُوَ يُطْعِمُنِي وَيَسْقِينَ. And the one who, it is he who feeds me, and it is he who gives me to drink. وَإِذَا مَرِضْتُ فَهُوَ يَشْفِينَ. And when I am sick, it is he who heals me. وَالَّذِي يُمِيتُنِي ثُمَّ يُحْيِينِي. And who is the one who causes me to die and then gives me life. وَالَّذِي أَطْمَعُ أَنْ يَغْفِرَ لِي خَطِيئَتِي يَوْمَ الدِّينِ. And the one who I am keenly avid that he forgive for me my error on the day of reckoning. رَبِّ هَبْ لِي حُكْمًا. O Lord, grant me judgment. وَأَلْحِقْنِي بِالصَّالِحِينَ. O Lord, grant me judgment and make me with your righteous servants. وَاجْعَلْ لِي لِسَانَ صِدْقٍ فِي الْآخِرِينَ. And grant me a true tongue with, and then you can read the rest of the rest of the verses, right? And till verse 89, which is highlights that يَوْمَ لَا يَنْفَعُ مَالٌ وَلَا بَنُونَ إِلَّا مَنْ أَتَى اللَّهَ بِقَلْبٍ سَلِيمٍ. These are really, so you can mention these verses in the context of the adab of Sayyidina Ibrahim, right? But the Prophet ﷺ pointed to this reality as well, right? Where? When تُؤْمِنَ بِالْقَدَرِ خَيْرِهِ وَشَرِّهِ مِنَ اللَّهِ. That you believe in destiny, both its bad, good and bad, are from Allah. Right? So we affirm that without equivocation. Right? Alhamdulillah. Right? Okay, then he says, وَغَايَرَتْ أَمْرًا وَعِلْمًا وَالرِّضَى كَمَا ثَبَتْ. That these are distinct from the divine command and knowledge and good pleasure as is established. Right? So the summary of this is that the divine will and power are distinct from his command and his knowledge and his good pleasure. Right? So Allah, right? Allah's will specifies, his power originates. Right? Allah specifies what will be, and Allah's power originates that which will be. That's will and power. And these are distinct from his command and his knowledge and his good pleasure. Right? And these relate to right? Will and power relate, يعني الإرادة والقدرة, right? Irada and Qudra relate to Allah's qada, al-qada wal-qadr, to divine decree and destiny. So we affirm everything is by divine decree and destiny. And we'll be coming further to talk about that, right? That Allah's will specifies, that is Allah's qada. His power originates what was specified, that is qadr, according to the Ash'aris, right? The Maturidis just defined it in the opposite way. But we also affirm the التكليف والاستطاعة. We affirm moral responsibility, taklif, capacity, والاختيار, right? Right? والكسب. We affirm 4 things for the human being, right? That they're morally responsible. Allah has created them morally responsible, able. By their ability, they make choices and they acquire praise and blame, right? Now, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in making the servants morally responsible, has commanded and prohibited. Right? Has commanded and prohibited. He is pleased with when the servant, Allah's pleasure, right, relates. So we can you give me the, so Allah's pleasure, His rida, right, with respect, for the monitor. Allah's pleasure relates to, with respect to His creation, relates to the servant choosing to act in accordance with His command. Right? So Allah's pleasure relates to the servant choosing to act in accordance with His command. Can you see it? Right? Right? So al-rida, and by al-rida, right? By al-rida is rida Allah bi'abdihi. Right? Allah is being pleased with His servant. Relates to what? Relates to the choice of the servant. Right? Right? The servants, ikhtiyar, their choice. Right? Which is how they acquire praise and blame. Right? Allah's knowledge, He knows all things. Right? So by ar-rida, Allah being pleased, we refer to Allah's being pleased with His servant. Ar-rida, Allah is being pleased with His servant. Everything, right? Everything, you can't just make it appear on the thing. Okay. Bismillah. So that's all I wanted to just, right? So we have, we have, on the one hand, we have Allah's irada and qudra. These relate to qada and qadr, right? Human responsibility relates to these four matters. taklif, moral responsibility, istita'a, capacity, right? Ikhtiyar, choice, and kasb, acquisition of praise and blame, right? Allah's good pleasure, and by ar-rida here, we mean rida Allahi ta'ala bi'abdihi. Allah is being well pleased with His servant. This relates to how the servant directs their choice. So if they acted in accordance with the divine command, we say Allah is pleased with that. If they acted contrary to the divine command, we say Allah is displeased with that. So, right? And Allah's knowledge encompasses all things, and we'll be coming to knowledge in a moment. So this is just a context. Let's get back together. Bismillah. So he says, rahimahullah, وغايرت أمرا إلى آخره حاصل ذلك أن القسمة رباعية. The summary of this is that there's a four-part division. إما أن يأمر ويريد, either he commands and he wills, كإيمان المؤمن والأنبياء, like the belief of the believers and the prophets, أمرهم به وأراده منهم. Allah commanded them to it and He willed it for them. بدليل وقوعه, with the evidence that it happened. Right? Right? And this is what you would call, this relates to the rida of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Yani, واختاروه, right? واختاروه فرضي بهم, right? And they chose it, so He's pleased with them, right? Because the rida relates to the ikhtiyar or adamul ikhtiyar. They're choosing something or not choosing something. Right? وَإِمَّا أَنْ لَا يُرِيد وَلَا يَأْمُرْ, and that which He neither willed nor commanded. كَكُفْرِ مَنْ ذُكِرْ, such as the disbelief of those who willed. Allah did not command them to disbelieve, and He did not will for them to disbelieve. وَلَمْ يَأْمُرْهُمْ بِهِ وَلَمْ يُرِدْهُ مِنْهُمْ, He neither commanded them to disbelieve, nor did He wish for them to disbelieve. إِذْ لَوْ أَرَادَهُ لَوَقَعَ, because if He willed it, it would have happened. وَإِمَّا أَنْ يَأْمُرَ وَلَا يُرِيد, and there are things that He commanded, but He did not will. كَإِيمَانِ أَبِي جَهْلٍ وَإِبْلِيسٍ, such as the faith of Abu Jahl and Iblis. وَأَضْرَابِهِمْ, and the like of them. نَعُوذُ بِاللَّهِ مِنْ حَالِهِمْ. أَمَرَهُمْ بِالْإِيمَانِ, Allah commanded them to believe. وَلَمْ يُرِدْهُ مِنْهُمْ, but He did not will it for them. إِذْ لَوْ أَرَادَهُ لَوَقَعَ, because had He willed it, it would have happened. But we affirm. So Allah's will relates to divine decree. But we affirm both divine decree and we affirm moral responsibility for the humans and the jinn. Allah's good pleasure relates to how we make choices on the basis of moral responsibility. And our choices are governed by the divine command. Right? And the key to this, and it's something that, these things are unpacked step by step, but they're interrelated. So some of it we need to mention is where does knowledge come in here? Because Allah's will specifies things happen because Allah originated them with His power. Right? توجد الأشياء بقدرته تعالى. Things are originated by the power of Allah. And that's qadr. وفق إرادته. The divine, that's qadr, which is Allah originating things with His power in accordance with His eternal will. That's qadr, that's destiny unfolding. It was all destined. The disbelief of Abu Jahl was divine will. It was by his disbelief was created by Allah in accordance with His eternal will. Destiny according to divine decree. What is divine decree? The qada of Allah. This is the critical point to understand. That the qada of Allah is what Allah eternally specifies with His will in accordance with His knowledge. So eternally Allah has willed that Abu Jahl not believe. But Allah's will is in accordance with His knowledge. Right? تخصيص الله تعالى الأشياء بإرادته وفق علمه, in accordance with His knowledge. And what is knowledge? Knowledge shows things exactly as they are. And we'll be looking at the attributes of knowledge next. So knowledge shows things as they are. So إنما أراد الله للعبد ما علم أنه مختاره. Allah only willed for the servant, for the humans and the jinn, in accordance with what He knew, what He knows eternally, they'll choose. فَلِلَّهِ الْحُجَّةُ الْبَالِغَةُ. So Allah has the manifest proof on His servant. How does that work? That is beyond our comprehension. But we can affirm this unequivocally. Right? إنما مختار الله لك ما علم أنك مختاره. Right? So Allah did in no way has compelled Abu Jahl to disbelief. Allah did, even though that is eternally willed by Allah, the disbelief. Because why? The critical thing is when Iblis refused to bow. Even Iblis did not make the argument against Allah. Well, you created my action. Iblis knows Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Even he does not dare make this argument. Does he make that argument? He comes close to that, but even Iblis does not dare make that argument. What does he say? Bima aghwaytani. By you causing me to go astray. But he affirms his agency. He affirms his agency. He is stuck with his choices. كُلُّ نَفْسٍ بِمَا كَسَبَتْ رَهِينَ. That's the tragedy of Iblis. Because he had knowledge. He knew Allah. He was conscious of Allah too. He had irfan. He had ibadah. But what he lacked was love. So he did not submit. He didn't have ishq. He had three ains. Ilm and ibadah and irfan. Knowledge and devotion and awareness of the divine. But he didn't have ishq. He did not have love. So he fell. Right? Subhanallah. Allahumma salli wa sallim wa barik ala Sayyidina Muhammad. Similar. Why? Because when Iblis refused to bow to Sayyidina Adam, and likewise every refusal in history, who created that action? With his power. In the context of that moment. Na'udhu billahi ta'ala min mithlihi. He has willed it eternally, beyond time. تقدمت كل الكائنات حديثها. Right? Allah Most High, His attributes, their reality precedes beyond time, any time itself. Right? But what He willed was in accordance with His knowledge. And Allah only willed in accordance with what He knows will be. So if you look in the mirror, as it were, of divine knowledge, what do you see? You see Iblis choosing to refuse. So he's under the divine wrath. So we affirm both aspects. In eternity, قُلْ كُلٌّ مِّنْ عِنْدِ اللَّهِ. It's all from Allah. It's qada and qadr. It's decree and destiny. It's al-khalq, it's iradatun and qudra. Right? It's decree and destiny. That's undeniable. But He only decreed for you in accordance with His knowledge. Knowledge simply shows things as they are. So at the point when Iblis refused, that was created by Allah, it was willed by Allah. That's destiny unfolding, decree, eternal. But we affirm, but Iblis fell and he recognizes his own fall and takes ownership of it, and he himself, although he says, well, you misguided me, but I will do this and this. He affirms his own will. Right? And it's very interesting how Iblis talks about himself, because he is acknowledging both qada and qadr, but he's also affirming responsibility. And that's the grave tragedy of the condition of Iblis. But that is in accordance with Allah's knowledge, right? So that's why, Allah only willed in accordance with what He knew would choose. How you choose, that is what qada and that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's good pleasure relates to. Right? So, وَإِمَّا أَن يُرِيدَ وَلَا يَأْمُرُ. And the first person to explain this to me in a manner that was clear and cogent and on the precise language and usage of the ulama was Shaykh Talal al-Ahdab, hafidhahullah ta'ala. And that is the وَإِمَّا أَن يُرِيدَ وَلَا يَأْمُرُ. And there are things that He willed but did not command, such as the disbelief of those mentioned, كَكُفْرِ مَنْ ذُكِرْ أَرَادَهُ مِنْهُمْ بِدَلِيلِ وُقُوعِ مِنْهُمْ. And He willed it for them, willed their disbelief, with the proof that it happened. Because had He and وَلَمْ يَأْمُرْهُمْ بِهِ, but He did not command them to disbelieve. Right? He did not command them to disbelieve. فَبَيْنَ الْأَمْرِ وَالْإِرَادَةِ عُمُومٌ وَخُصُوصٌ. So between the divine command is an interrelationship. Right? Right? So one is more general and one is more specific. عُمُومٌ وَخُصُوصٌ. مِنْ وَجْهٍ. But they share in some things. So everything is by the irada of Allah. It happening or not happening. His command is a subset of that. يَجْتَمِعَانِ فِي إِيمَانِ الْمُؤْمِنِ. They are both found, Allah willed it, and He commanded it with respect to what is, right? Like the belief of the believer. وَيَنْفَرِدُ الْأَمْرُ دُونَ الْإِرَادَةِ فِي إِيمَانِ الْكَافِرِينَ. But the command is found without the will in the faith of the disbeliever. He commanded it, but He did not will it. Why? Because they did not choose it. وَتَنْفَرِدُ الْإِرَادَةُ دُونَ الْأَمْرِ فِي كُفْرِهِمْ. And the will is found, but not the command in their disbelief. He willed it because He knew, because His will is in accordance with His knowledge. He knew that this is what they'll choose. But He did not command it. واختلف العلماء في جواز نسبة فعل الشر لله. The ulama differed on whether it's possible to ascribe evil to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. واستحسن بعض المتأخرين, some of the later scholars said, جوازه في مقام التعليم. لا غير. لا في غيره, not outside of that, right? So we can say it because of the need for ta'zeem and adab, right? Because of reverence and proper manners with respect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, وهو المعتمد, and this is the relied upon position. وكذا يقال, and because of these two things, right? And he leaves their reasoning implicit, but basically, للتعظيم والأدب الواجب, because of the respect and reverence that is required. وكذا يقال في نحو خالق القردة والخنازير, the creator of monkeys and pigs. وكل أمر خسيس, and every lowly matter, right? So فلا يقال, so we don't say فلا يجوز سبحان من رزق الهدهد, glory be to the one who provided for the hudhud. What's that, the hoopoe? It's a small little bird. سبحان من دبب الشوك, right? And likewise with respect to who flattened the thorn, etc. إن لم يكن في مقام التعليم, outside the context of teaching, because Allah is the creator of everything. Why are you singling out a matter of insignificance, right? For the most significant. قوله وأمرا, right? Right? And this is distinct from the divine command. أي نفسيا وهو اقتضاء فعل غير كف. Right? This is the divine command. This is the command الأمر أي التشريعي. Right? أمرا أي الأمر التشريعي. Right? This is the legislative command, right? Which is an address that entails doing something and not desisting from it. مدلول عليه بلفظ غير, that is indicated by by words such as stop. بلفظ غير نحو كف, right? Indicated by other than the words indicating desisting, right? So this is an unusual way of defining it, right? Amr is that, so he says, so this is the legislative command, because you can say that the command of Allah is of two types. There's the legislative command, and there is the existential command. Kun fayakun, be and it is. The existential command is the kun, goes back to the will and power of Allah. But that's not what we're talking about. Here we're talking about the legislative command, al-amr at-tashri'i, the legislative command, which is Allah subhanahu, which is khitabullahi ta'ala, is Allah's address, al-muta'alliq bi-af'al al-mukallafin, relating to the actions of those morally responsible, right? To do something, right? للفعل على وجه الحتم, right? To do something firmly, and it entails luzum, that they must do this, right? Okay. So that's the command. وعلما, قوله وعلما أي لأن تعلقه تعلق انكشاف عام في الواجبات والجائزات والمستحيلات, because the relationship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's knowledge is general. It relates to the necessary, possible and impossible, and what does knowledge do? It's inkishaf. it discloses all that is necessary, possible, and cause. So Allah eternally knows everything. All that is necessary, all that is possible, and all that is impossible, duna sabqi khafa, without ever not knowing it. Right? And we've talked a little bit about how these relate. وَالرِّضَى, and this is distinct from the good pleasure of Allah. What is good pleasure? هُوَ قَبُولُ الشَّيْء وَالْإِثَابَ عَلَيْهِ. It is accepting something and rewarding for it. Accepting something and rewarding for it. Right? And this relates, right? ويتعلق باختيار العبد وكسبه. Right? This relates to the choices of the servants and their acquisition. فبين الأمر والرضا تلازم. So there is a necessary relationship between the command of Allah and His good pleasure. فمن فعل ما أمر الله رضي الله عنه. Right? Whoever does what Allah is pleased with, what Allah has commanded, Allah is pleased with them. And والعكس, and the opposite. لأنه لا يأمر إلا بما يرضاه. Because Allah only commands that which is pleasing to Him. كما ثبت, as is established. أي بالدليل العقلي, both by rational proof and by revelation. Right? So he says, وهو أن تقول الله صانع للعالم بالاختيار, that Allah is the creator of the world by choice. وكل ما كان كذلك تجب له الإرادة. Anyone who's like this, they need will. Right? So now we're going back to the discussion on the will. Right? But before we get to كما ثبت, His good pleasure, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's, so the summary is that Allah's will, His power and will are distinct from His command and good pleasure, right? Right? Why? Because His will and power relate to divine decree and destiny. And everything is decreed by Allah, and as things happen, it's destiny unfolding, right? And this is distinct from His command. Because why? His command relates to the actions of those morally responsible. So we affirm those four things that we highlighted. We affirm that humans and jinn are morally responsible. And they're responsible upon them receiving the message. Then what happens? They have capacity. Right? And capacity is affirmed at the point of action, at the point of choosing. Because Allah is sustaining them, but He is given that capacity. Salamatul asbabi wal alat. They have the soundness of means and capacities, right, and abilities. Right? So in summary, they have a contingent will and power that they're able to choose and able to act on their choices. So therefore, by having capacity, we affirm choices for the morally responsible. So everything is by the qada and qadar of Allah, but we affirm these things. For the servant, all dependent upon Allah. There's no independence from Allah. But we affirm undeniably choice. So the good pleasure of Allah relates to that He has commanded and prohibited. Those morally responsible, if they choose in accordance with the divine command, that is what's pleasing to Allah. Right? And if they choose contrary to the command of Allah, that is displeasing to Allah. Now Allah knows their choices eternally. And that's what He willed for them. So even though it is all willed by Allah and created by Allah, Allah has the complete, it is befitting His Majesty to be pleased with these and displeased with those. Because He only willed for them in accordance with what they knew. And this is the amr at-taklifi. This is the legislative command of Allah. There's the other command that is described in the Quran. إِنَّمَا أَمْرُهُ إِذَا أَرَادَ شَيْءٍ. His command, when He wills something, is simply be, and it is. And that's called al-amr at-takwini, the existential command. And that is takhsis, that is His specifying with His will and His originating with His power. Okay. So we'll stop there. There is one discussion about understanding how. So it says, "Kama thabat," as is established, like Allah's will is also established by, rationally. He says, "بالدليل العقلي وأن تقول الله صانع العالم بالاختيار." Allah has created this world by choice. وكل ما كان كذلك تجب له الإرادة. That anyone who's like that, they require the attribute of will. So we affirm that Allah is the necessary existent. Does the necessary existent need to create the world? Say no. We already established that He is the necessary existent. But we affirm that this world exists. It would entail that, the necessary existent chose for it to exist. Therefore, He has that attribute that entails choice, which is will. فَيُنْتِجْ اللَّهُ تَجِبُ لَهُ الْإِرَادَةِ. That Allah, will is necessary. This is a very simplified proof. This cuts through a lot of philosophical arguments that does God have to create? Right? Does God have will? Does God, what is the relationship between the creator and creation? Right? And this is circumvented by affirming that no, that the merely possible is merely possible. It does not, there's no reason why it needs to exist, and it is not against the perfection of Allah that there not be a world. But there is, because we perceive it, and because Revelation tells us there is a world. There's one more investigation with respect to divine will. So he says, there is an argument, and this is with other sects, right? This, in a simple work, this didn't need to be there, but sometimes scholars like Imam Sawi mention certain nuances just to tell us that, look, we're simplifying things for you. But if you were to lift the lid, there's a lot of discussion below, especially with the sects. But, to keep things clean, keep away from the sects. Right? So he says that وَعْلَمْ أَنَّهُمْ اخْتَلَفُوا فِي مَعْنَى إِرَادَتِهِ تَعَالَى. That know that they, meaning those who engaged in discussion of matters of belief, i.e. the theologians, but both the mainstream and non-mainstream, differed on what does divine will mean. قال سعد الدين, meaning Imam Sa'd al-Din al-Taftazani, said in Sharh al-Maqasid, in his commentary on the Maqasid, one of the great reference works in Sunni theology, فعندنا هي صفة قديمة زائدة على الذات إلى آخر ما تقدم. So according to the Sunni mainstream, it is defined as an eternal attribute that affirms a meaning beyond the entity itself, by which that we've seen, by which Allah specifies some of the possible with some of what's possible for it. And other sects said otherwise. قال وعند الجبائي, according to al-Jubba'i, who is one of the great early leaders of the Mu'tazila, صفة زائدة على الذات قائمة لا بمحل. That it's an attribute that's beyond the entity, that subsists but without place. And they have distinct usages of place, this and that. وعند الكرامية, according to the Karramis, صفة حادثة قائمة بعد. That because will specifies So they say specification takes place in time, so therefore it is an originated attribute that exists to the entity of Allah. That's absurd, because if Allah is entity, then لا يقوم الحادث بالقديم والقديم لا يتصف بحادث. That something originated does not exist through something, does not subsist in something eternal, because this is in time, this is outside time, right? So they tied themselves in intellectual knots. But وعند الضرار, and ضرار الغطفاني, who's another of the Mu'tazilah, he said, هي نفس الذات. It is the entity itself, right? Because most of the Mu'tazilah did not affirm the affirmative attributes. They said Allah has ability by His entity, right? And he also pointing that when they say قال المعتزلة, the Mu'tazilah say that there's a whole range of opinions. The ulama acknowledge it, but they just sort of clarify those opinions that are at opposition to Ahl Sunnah. وعند النجار, and according to النجار, Al-Husayn ibn Muhammad Al-Najjar Al-Razi, who was another of the Mu'tazilites, and you know there's many sects amongst the Mu'tazilites, sifatun salbiyya, that will is an attribute of negation. وهي كون الفاعل ليس بمكره ولا ساهٍ, and that will is a negative attribute, is that it is that the one who acts is not compelled nor unaware. وَالْحَقُّ مَا ذَكَرْنَاهُ, and the truth is what we have mentioned. So then we get to the attribute of knowledge. He says وَعِلْمُهُ وَلَا يُقَالُ مُكْتَسَبْ فَاتْبَعْ سَبِيلِ الْحَقِّ وَاطْرَحِ الرِّيَابِ, and his knowledge, and we do not say it is acquired, so follow the way of truth and leave all doubt. So we'll stop there. وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم. Any questions here? We'll take those outside of the class. اللهم صل وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.
Here's a question. You mentioned reading a text of a similar level alongside the text you're studying. Is there a particular work you would recommend reading alongside this sharh?
That's who asked that question?
Imran.
Yes, it depends on one's level, right? It's useful to consult one's teachers about that, because different people are at different levels, right? That one of the things to do, if you've studied other texts, well, I would suggest the most important thing to read with what you're reading. Like, so if someone's attending this class and you're studying Sharh al-Jawhara, if you studied something before, so here at Seekers Guidance Canada, you know, a number of the students here have studied Sharh al-Kharid al-Bahiyya. So the most important thing to study, to read along, is something you've already read before, to consolidate those meanings and to connect. So you connect what you've studied before to what you're studying here. So there's really useful new things that you're studying, not all of it, but the key things that clarify what you did before, you connect it back to that, so you could annotate your previous text, that, you know, there are extra things that come out, or even to say, check page such and such of Sharh al-Sawi, but there's things that you've covered before that detail out what's come here, so you cross-annotate in that way. So that's number one. Number two, pick something that is at your level, depending on what you've studied before, right? Depending on what you have studied before. One of the things that the Mashaykh would recommend is to read clear, similar level mutun. Like, you know, that's very useful. So for example, the Aqidah al-Tahawiyya is very clear. If you've not studied it before, read along with it. Right? You don't have to go into the commentaries and so on, just the matan. The Aqidah al-Tahawiyya, if you were to read along, and you'll find many decisive principles. And the Aqidah al-Tahawiyya is expressed very clearly, so it doesn't require commentary. Right? And that's an easy read. Someone could go through and make jardul fawaid. One could take the points of benefit from the Tahawiyah that relate to critical things here. He has beautiful, clear expressions, right? Like today we mentioned the thing about لا تدركه الأفهام, that intellects cannot encompass their understanding of him, etc. Or Imam al-Ghazali's قواعد العقائد, Foundations of Islamic Belief. Particularly, first, just read the first chapter. The first chapter, again, has beautiful principles of belief. And those are keys, like Mabhath al-Tanzih, the section of Tanzih. It's very brief, but has some beautiful expressions that consolidate your knowledge of. Likewise, when you look at power, look at the section of Imam al-Ghazali's Qawaid al-Aqaid, just the chapter 1, the Aqidah al-Qudsiyya, the core belief section. And that's also, of course, beautifully translated into English by Sheikh Noor Keller. Then the rest, then book, chapter 2 expresses how you study Aqidah, but chapter 3 is very useful as well in deepening. So if someone went through Sharh al-Sawi on the Jawhara and they reviewed what they studied before in the Kharida or the Sharh al-Kharida, if they read along in the Aqidah Tahawiyah, if they read at least chapter 1 of Qawaid al-Aqaid, if they could do chapter 1, 2 and 3 as they went along, and it doesn't have to be a deep reading, but to get some of the key principles, etc., you would gain a lot. You would gain a lot. Right? And then in particular places, I've been recommending different things. It's useful to have Bajuri on the Jawhara, Tuhfat al-Murid, to have it. Don't get lost in it, but when we do mention that this is useful there, that's useful, do check it out. Once in a while, we have recommended Shaykh al-Buti's Kubra al-Yaqiniyat al-Kawniyya. That's a big book, and a talib ilm should have read it at some point. You'll be much more confident reading it after having studied Sharh al-Sawi. But here and there, when we recommend, check this out there, check that out there, that builds one's confidence in accessing those books. And of course, there's so much written on Aqidah, right? But we also have to keep in mind that what we quoted from Shaykh Abdul Rahman, etc., that this is not the door to Allah, right? This is the door of knowing what we must believe about Allah, understanding it, protecting our sound belief. But we come to Allah biqalbin salim, with a heart that is sound, right? Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi sallam. We'll stop there. We'll start the next class at 5:30.